Okay, while they're setting up, I wanted to try something. And it's always a bad idea to try things, but we'll give it a shot. Do some of you have mobile devices or something connected to the web in here? We have Wi-Fi. Yeah, I'm hoping at least 5 people are able to do this. I wanted to do a quick poll before we get started. And hopefully we'll be able to use some of this within the panel. We'll see instructions in a sec. Okay, so if you can open up your browser on whatever device you have in front of you, and you go to Kahoot, KAHOOT.IT, you'll be asked to enter a PIN. And you'll be asked to enter in a name, but you can enter whatever name you like. You don't have to use your real name. Just please, nothing naughty. And you guys are free to do this if you'd like. Okay, we've got Matt and Lemaire. I think I know who that is. All I want to do is ask 5 simple questions. These are multiple choice questions. And after each question, we'll see what our audience thinks. Wait just 1 or 2 more seconds.
I love that we have a self-proclaimed madman in the audience. It's going to be good.
All right, let's dive in. We've got 30, 38. Even if you join late, it's fine. Let's go. So only 5 questions. The first question is, at the moment, do you think your company is focusing more on getting better at speed of changes or safety of changes? And you'll see 4 shapes, and you just enter the shape. Triangle is speed, diamond is safety, and circle is neither. What does your organization care more about, if you had to pick one? Yeah, but I have a way to do this. Now where? That's why I said it's a bad idea to try something new, but... Oh, see, look at that, next. There. Okay, so... 1 second, let's go back big. Okay, so it's mostly oriented towards speed, which I think is a little bit surprising to me. I would have thought a room like this, we're talking more about safety, but a lot of you are in organizations that are more oriented towards speed, at least at the moment. Okay, second question. When you plan your technology, how far ahead do you actually look? Do you have a 10-year plan or greater, a 5 to 10-year plan, 1 to 5 years, or less than 1 year? So triangle is greater than 10, diamond is 5 to 10, circle is 1 to 5, and a square would be less than 1 year. How far ahead do you think with your technology plans? One to 5 years by a long shot, right? So right in that sweet spot. And there's a few of you, at least 2 of you, who have plans for longer than 10 years. Hopefully, once we get interactive, I'd love to hear from you, the people who have really, really long views. Okay, question number 3, here's an easy one. Is open source software an important part of your architecture? I put in that weasel word, important, so you don't get away with just saying, well, there's that one guy. So triangle is yes, diamond is no, and circle if you're really not sure. What do you think? Open source, yes or no? Any guesses?
I reckon we're going to have quite a few not sures, actually.
All right, let's see. No, it's a resounding yes, 25, with a few people saying maybe not yet. 7 not sures. Okay, question number 4. Which of the following improvements would you like to see most? So I'm only going to let you pick one thing. Would you like to see more decentralization, whatever that means to you? Or diamond, more automation and tooling? Circle, better standards? Or square, better people, people with better skills? If you can only pick one. Blue, you think blue. Automation. All right.
I'd expect you to think of green here.
I'm going for green.
Well, that's a pretty even distribution.
What's wrong with everyone?
So it's mostly automation and people. So machines and humans. All right.
Can I just comment quickly?
Yes.
If you hit high on the higher skilled people, the other stuff comes.
Yeah, that's one view.
Build the tool, they will improve the standard.
If you let them.
You get the people.
Right.
Because a lot of organizations get them and then send them to meetings.
Higher skilled plus centralization may be challenging, right? Right. Higher skilled in a very bureaucratic organization is difficult. But we're almost done. Last question, and then we're going to dive in. I think we're ready to start talking, it's sounding like, right? I asked this because I just want to know. This is just for me. Are you a microservices shop? Like, do you call yourself that? And I'm not going to ask you to tell me what a microservices is. I won't ask you that. I just want to know. Do you self-identify as a microservices shop? What's the fourth answer? I don't know?
When we grow up.
A little bit. No, I want you to take a stand. It's either yes or no. It's black or white, or red or blue. Okay, so where did we end up? Oh, I see. We're still waiting for one person. Is that how this works? I'm not going to wait 72 seconds. Okay, hold on. There we go. No. 31 no's, 9 yeses. All right. Thank you very much. I think that's going to inform us a little bit here, right? I just want to make sure, do we all have microphones?
No, have to fight over it.
I gave Eric one job.
We're sharing. Sharing economies here.
All right, I apologize. So given what we know about attitudes here, I think hopefully that can inform our discussion. I'm actually going to ask you, right? I'm actually going to ask you each to introduce yourself before we start. You don't have to turn it on. You should be able to speak. Matthew, why don't you go ahead first?
Thanks, Ronnie. My name's Matthew Crabb, and I manage and edit an information platform called QAFinancial.com, and we have a website, and we run events. We run events in London and New York and Singapore. And perhaps the relevance of my being here is that our audience is they're people at financial firms responsible for app delivery. I'll talk about app delivery more generally than APIs, perhaps. And going back to Leda's point about the importance of regulatory controls, one of the reasons we exist and we have a good business is that our audience is composed of vendor risk managers, compliance people, risk managers. You're seeing more and more people with the title head of IT risk management at financial firms. You're seeing more people with titles like head of DevOps, and that's our audience. I'll leave it at that.
Jack?
Hi, I'm Jack Burrows. I'm principal with Capco Digital, and I spend most of my time designing and delivering new customer products for retail banks around London. So kind of going back to Ronnie's slide, I spend most of my time in the idea execution, trying to work out how we can go quicker and faster. That's me.
And Leda, maybe just a quick reintroduction.
Yeah, sure. For the couple of people who came in after my talk, you'll have to explain yourself later. I'm Leda Gliftis. I work in the digital practice at Sapient, and I grew up in the fintech space before it was famous, and then became a banker, which is something I still don't understand myself. But I have recently exited the banking world in the midst of the revolution.
Good time. All right, Jack, I'm going to start with you. I'm going to ask you a question here. We saw people say no to the microservices shop question. We've heard a lot about upcoming changes. From what you see, do you think most financial services organizations are ready for this kind of era of innovation, or is there a lot of work to do?
I think there's a lot of work to do.
Okay.
And I'm not so sure it's just about a microservices architecture. I think it's everything we've talked about today around people, embracing that change, and working together to deliver faster, better. And microservices is just one way to enable that.
Is it a case where it's possible? Let me ask that. Anyone on the panel? Is this an industry where, you know, everyone said, we saw like 30-40% of the people said speed is the priority.
Yeah, I'd like to answer that one because, I mean, again, Leda spoke about this earlier, the regulatory constraints on financial firms. In fact, the largest financial firms, the Goldman Sachs, the Morgan Stanleys, the JP Morgans, have been the ones that have led the adoption of open source tools, for example. Cloud, I mean, Capital One in the US is probably the largest single financial firm in the world that's come out and said we're moving our platforms to the cloud, specifically Amazon. If you go to a conference and you, I've been to a number of these where you have somebody speaking from the head of QA from an investment bank, and then you have somebody from Spotify or Netflix or Betfair in the other room, that's the room that's going to be full. And financial firms want, I spoke to a CIO this week who was saying, you know, that's what we want to be. We want to have all our developers testing. We want to be releasing in iterations that are really, really fast. That's the objective. But the constraints are, well, twofold really. Regulatory. I think a really good example of this is MiFID, the European investment rules, which come into force in January 2018 and require every firm to certify, investment firms to certify that its algorithms will not disrupt markets. And we saw, you know, just this week, Monday morning, with the crash of the pound in Asia, 6%, you know, they're looking at that. Was that set off by algorithms like the 2010 May flash crash? You know, regulators are looking at this. And regulators around the world are taking a more proactive view on the supervision of what they call critical app development, and the Singaporeans, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, are a leader in this respect. You can look on their website and you can see they have guidelines up there about how they're supervising app delivery. And here and in the US, the Fed in particular is looking at taking a much more proactive view on supervising the development of apps, on the development of apps at financial firms.
So there's a lot of regulatory control, but I'm imagining you have something to say based on your talk.
Yes, I do. Yes, I always have something to say. Two things, really. Anything is possible, right? And it's the old triangle of what you want, when you want it, and how much money have you got, right? And if you can play with those parameters, absolutely everything is possible. I think when we're talking about a transition to microservices architecture, an actual microservices architecture, we're talking about a holistic transition to a different way of doing business, which goes back to my talk. And I think there are two things we need to remember there. And again, I will go back to humans and running a business. One is that no matter how well banks are doing or how badly they're doing, there is an undeniable squeeze to margins, and their pots of cash that are left over from running the shop, such as it is, are limited. Those pots of cash are fought over for everything that a bank wants to do in terms of business development, in terms of remediation. Everything you need to do comes out of that one pot of cash. And that pot of cash seems humongous to the individuals that are faced with it. But actually, if you're looking at a global infrastructure, it doesn't stretch very far. So transitions tend to be triggered by events. And those events are either disastrous, like a massive fine or a new regulation that completely transforms your business, or a shock factor of some sort or other. I have seen few transitions to a full microservices infrastructure, and they were all triggered by events, not aspiration. And that's one thing to bear in mind. The second thing to bear in mind is that future-proofing a business is an art, not a science. And if you go to some of the more successful commercial technology-based businesses, and I won't name them, but I'm sure we can all think of a few, who started 5 years ago, say, that's a good number, and had, by design or luck, an amazing market product fit. and they went for speed, hell for leather, because you know what? Those of us who have been in a startup know what it's like not to know if you'll be able to keep the lights on next month. You don't muck about with future-proofing, you test as little as possible. You do certain things because survival is of the essence when you're that small. And if you get your niche in the market and it works, you go all out. Speed is of the essence. You go for it. 5 years later, you're a leader in your space, and you have so much technical debt, it's not even funny, considering others look to you as an amazing inspiration. And I am not going, although a little in my head, I do. But we do need to remember that if everything needs to come back to being able to keep the lights on in a business, and actually sometimes your own success undermines your ability to take a step back and look at your architecture. And microservices are, in so many ways, a brilliant solution to a lot of the big institutional problems, but they would require a massive transition. To me, the real question is, what sort of event would trigger it and justify the mind share and the resources, human and monetary, that would need to be dedicated to it to do it properly.
So we'll come to this event thing, but I want to be clear. So it sounds like you're agreeing with Matthew that there's a general aspect of safety we just can't avoid, right? This, you talked about having an undo. You talked about maybe even changing the dynamics so that organization can become more risk averse. But fundamentally, this is a business where every cent counts. Is that right?
Absolutely. And if you unpack that, there is an element of the rules as they are, and we could argue whether the rules are actually of an old era and need to be changed, but until they're changed, they are the rules and they need to be dealt with.
I think we can accept that generally, and we heard that over and over. What about from your experience in terms of events that cause things to change that Lita's mentioning? Have you seen much?
Well, Lita mentioned technical debt, and I think increasingly the definition of technical debt is financial firms need to know which apps they can afford to fail out of their maybe you're talking about the biggest firms, maybe 300 releases a week. They need to know which ones the regulators are going to insist must not fail. They need to know which ones are important from a regulatory point of view, which isn't always the same as the ones that make the most money or are most important for the development of the business. And I think the other big driver here is cost. Again, we've talked about that. A lot of firms have cut costs by outsourcing, particularly in terms of testing and quality assurance services. A year ago, when we launched our site and you looked at the websites of the big service providers, they all boasted about the numbers of people they employed, hundreds of thousands, 20,000, 50,000. You look now, they don't, because automation's coming, a big trend, and the banks are looking for their service partners to save money through automation. And the service providers are saying, no, you need to invest in this. You can't just expect us to cut our headcount. A lot of the banks here in Canary Wharf, they employ a lot of people on a contract basis who are employees of the big outsource providers. They have email addresses of the firms here, but they're not actually employed by them. And that's something that's going to change. Again, going back to this culture of trust that Lita was talking about, this is very important too. I mean, I don't think financial firms necessarily do have to trust their staff in that respect. I mean, one of the reasons that Python has become, so popular and so dominant among hedge funds and investment banks.
Python, the language?
Yes.
Is because popular amongst, I didn't know that.
Yeah, well, increasingly, it's been around a long time, but you talk to people about it, they say it's transparent, and that means that we can check more easily the work of an individual coder. This is particularly important for a hedge fund. It can be peer-reviewed much more easily, as well as getting iterations out there much more quickly. So again, I mean, firms, these firms out here, they've got the money. They are the technology leaders, but the constraints of, cost reduction and regulatory oversight are really what's driving a lot of their decisions.
It seems like it's always been that way in this industry, right? It's always been regulation. Jack, I want to make sure you get a chance to jump in here. What works? What doesn't? What have you seen?
So I think the retail banks I work with at the moment, no one's looking at moving to microservices just to avoid something failing. It's all driven around, we want to do something new. So in the context of APIs, in the context of PSD2 and open banking, they have to. They need to do something new. And how can they do that in a microservices way without relying on the big ESB shadow over everyone at the moment? So I think that's really important. The other thing I'd say, back to Matthew's point earlier around testing, I think the regulators are putting out these new laws, rules that say a bank can't fail. Someone like Spotify doesn't have that. But when was the last time you were using Spotify and it didn't work? There are all these technology companies who, even without regulation, are managing to keep their service up. And that is by investing in the microservices architecture. Correct?
Yeah, also, on the other hand, Amazon just had an outage 2 weeks ago. And, it didn't cause a huge problem. Some people didn't get to watch their film, right? And I think, is it fair to say it's different?
More embarrassing when you're at the shopping till,
right,
and you're trying to buy your shopping, and your card doesn't work.
So here's a question for all of you, and you don't have to agree on this, is there any point in the people in this room looking at the Ubers and the Amazons and the Netflix of the world?
Yes and no.
That's cheating.
It is, but I'll explain it.
Okay.
So I slightly disagree with two things that were mentioned, and I want to pick up on them because they tie to your point. One is we can't compare a single function, single deliverable business, no matter how big it is, like Spotify, to a complex, multi-product, multi-service, multi-channel business, no matter what it does, right? Because we're not comparing like with like, so it's an unfair comparison. And actually, Spotify crashed on me the other day. And I was more upset with that than I was with my bank not working, because I'm used to my bank not working.
And you've probably got 2 bank cards and only 1 Spotify account.
Exactly. So I can reduce to tears if my Sonos is not picking up my Spotify, whereas HSBC's down meh. But without dismissing the point, the reason I think we should dwell on it is because there is the argument of whether the organizations we have serving our financial needs are over time. And actually the model of the Spotify or the Uber is interesting from a business perspective, not a technology perspective. I do one thing, do it well, or become a distribution platform. So when we're talking about these examples, what is it we're looking at? And I do think that comparing unequal, non-similar things doesn't help, but questioning whether banks as institutions and our business models are relevant to the era is a very powerful one. I would, however, go back to Matt's earlier point and say that banks used to not trust their people. They can't afford to anymore for many reasons. Speed is of the essence, and as you were saying earlier, the more layers you add on top of your developers, the more delay you cause. And essentially you've hired and trained these people the same way. So it's questionable whether you're adding a qualitative differentiator. Secondly, the technology creates a certain degree of openness and transparency. And thirdly, we all know that there have been all these incidents of what I tend to call this guy Dave, who built a very complicated macro and then left. And then entire departments of banks grind to a halt because no one knows what on earth this guy Dave was doing. The startup I was in got our first break thanks to Dave. We love Dave. But fundamentally, the peer review of your code is to avoid this guy Dave. It's not because you don't necessarily trust your developers. We need to move away from that inability to trust our people. Fundamentally, I am representing Sapien right here, right now, and I don't have a keeper. They trust me to do what they hired me and pay me to do. It's that simple.
Okay.
I think blockchain's a really interesting example here because, as Leda was saying earlier, every bank's got a blockchain project, right? And to a certain extent, you run a panel on blockchain, people are a little bit bored of it now. But the focus is on the code. The DOA fund, I don't know if everybody's familiar with the story of the DOA fund, which crashed in February. So this was an Ether-based venture capital investment fund that paid dividends in the form of Ether. And somebody figured out how there was a simple fault in the code that enabled them to drain the fund by paying themselves dividends. So $80 million went overnight. And that was a simple coding error. And there's a real focus on this right now because everybody has these projects. And the opportunity they see is to develop smart contracts and distributed ledger platforms with the right hooks for automated testing. And they're very interested in talking about things like, how Netflix used Chaos Monkey to test, and can you apply that to blockchain contracts? And that's really where I think one of the frontiers is. But it's very rare that people working at banks have that opportunity to look at and this is another reason blockchain gets talked about a lot, because it's new. Most of the time they're wrestling with legacy systems, and that's the big difference between Spotify and a bank, a big bank. They've got lots of stuff written in COBOL, they've got lots of apps that don't speak to each other and don't interconnect, and that's their biggest challenge, which is again why Ronnie,
So how do you address that challenge? I mean, that
It's
always comes up.
Well, it's a big technology. The automation and the test virtualization is the big trend in technology here, as you were sort of alluding to earlier. And that's where they're all trying to figure out what investment they need to make and how that corresponds to headcounts, for example.
But specifically this thing about legacy, like you must run into this, you're trying to convince organizations to be faster.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the really interesting, kind of picking up on this theme around testing and ensuring that critical systems are always there when they need to be, is as these banks want to move faster, they want to experiment, they want to drive down that idea execution time, can they take an approach where they look at some ideas and go, this isn't business critical, maybe we don't need to have the same level of testing or the same SLAs around this as our core banking infrastructure. So I think that's where I'm spending a lot of time talking to banks at the moment, is we want to put out a new product. Is this going to move the needle if it falls over tonight? No. Can we go faster? Can we avoid some of the rigor we normally go through? But then you end up with the point you said there around a huge technical debt you've got to pay back later. So it's balancing the two.
And I do think there is an element of accepting that you will never fully get away from it. Like, Spotify will have to revisit their architecture at some point. Things are changing rapidly, and what is new today won't be new tomorrow. I've seen a couple of big firms moving down the path of future-proofing their infrastructure and actually accepting that nothing will be here in 10 times. So actually thinking about the ease of replacement as a core function in their design. The challenge you have there is that you don't have the right people to do that. So you start hiring for a different type of skill set, and once you start going down that path, your success almost hinges on whether you had all the conversations with your board early on about what it is you want these people to do. But if you are faced with an infrastructure that is complicated by acquisitions, because let's face it, there's a lot of that. There is no globalization architecture element to it, so just your systems are so specific to your jurisdictions, but your business isn't. And on top of it, you have all sorts of challenges, including the developers you need retiring or dying, which is happening with certain things. Whatever it is that forces you down the path of change, that might be the event that triggers a transition to microservices. And I've seen it with a couple of clients of ours where it wasn't a choice of microservices, it was a number of things weighing them down, and a microservices architecture being the only thing that would solve for everything.
Okay, very good. Let's get some questions. I see one hand, it shot up. So let me get over to you.
Christopher Tom from Pronovix. So I've been watching the microservices space and what people are writing about microservices, and like for a while everybody was like on the bandwagon, like this is like the new best thing ever and it's going to be perfect and there's not going to be any problems at all, and then you start seeing articles coming out now where people are having real trouble orchestrating microservices. And where they've kind of, I feel that it's kind of like a balancing thing where you have monolithic systems on one end and like the hardcore pure microservices on the other end, and that neither of the extremes are where you want to be, that you need to be somewhere in the middle. Like, do you see that also, or how is that evolving?
Oh, absolutely. I had a boss when I first started working in IT who said the problem with opportunity is that when you look at it, it looks a lot like hard work. And when back in the day when they had us in the basement, the business would come up with a set of requirements, and you would work some magic. And the magic would not necessarily be pretty, but it was magic. They didn't need to understand how it worked. And now we start having this fusion of conversations with the IT folks and the business folks weave. But the education isn't quite there yet. So you start talking at the very highest level of capabilities, of what it is this little toolkit may do for you, and it's magic. I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen people's faces when they first hear about DLT and the idea of a smart security, oh my God. And then you start moving down the implementation path, and there's, where the rubber hits the road, it's always messy. So I see it, but I don't just see it with microservices, I see it with everything. And I think it's a phase, and it will pass. As we're moving towards an era where the business and technology functions can no longer be separate because there is no way for those conversations to take place in isolation, we will stop having that emotional hijacking that the business has when they realize that there is no such thing as a silver bullet, end of. And we see it with a variety of technologies and a variety of fads. It's not just microservices, it's that moment where you realize there's no magic, a lot of hard work will be necessary, and the vaguer your business goals and the messier your existing infrastructure, technical and human, the harder it will be to transition. And Ronnie made that point very well in terms of what actually slows us down.
Right, but so picking up on microservice specifically, have you seen examples of what's been described?
So I've seen a lot of my clients from the business side find out about microservices and get really excited, and they go around and say, to tell their other business colleagues, go, oh, we can do this, we've got these microservices things, it's going to be easy, don't worry, we'll get it out the door by Christmas. And then the technologists go, oh dear. And what the technologist needs to do at this point is say, hang on a second, stop. Rather than playing along until it all goes boom and there's nothing there at Christmas, or they try and bend the microservice and it doesn't quite get out the door and it's all a failure. So there needs to be, again, if someone asked me, do I sit on the business technology side, I sort of go, I have worked with a lot of companies that don't distinguish, and the sooner we can get our banks, all companies in that space, the better, because at the moment, while that division between the business people and the technology people exists, this is going to keep on happening.
Okay, any other questions?
Hi, this is Danny. Well, my question is related to containerization and virtualization, and whether you see these technologies as enabling or as a prerequisite to build microservices.
I think that's a bit too technical for me. I'm going to look somewhere else.
Well, let's make the question bigger, if you don't mind. Not just microservices, but the kind of bank that we're talking about up here is containerization.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not a technologist, but going back to Leda's point about, it's not just an issue in development. I mean, it's a strategic issue. Banks struggle to benchmark the quality of the services that they're buying externally. For example, they get timesheets. They don't know how to relate those necessarily to the quality of the code or the app that's being developed. There's been a trend, the largest investment banks over the past couple of years, toward centralization, particularly as they've seen the opportunity in automation. They've wanted to centralize expertise across different divisions, wealth management, investment banking. Often the most sophisticated app developers have worked, say, in derivatives rather than in wealth management. So they've wanted to bring that development expertise into one place and manage data environments in one place. And from what I hear, they've been finding that's very, very difficult to do. They've created these global heads of app delivery, these global heads of QA, and they found it actually quite hard at the end of the day to achieve what they wanted to achieve. So now they're decentralizing again, which is going back to what you see as a big trend. So I'm not answering your technical question, but I'm answering in the way that I'm qualified to do.
So I'll give you an answer if no one else is willing to give.
I'd say that
Microservice
virtualization would be best practice.
Right.
Realistically and sadly, the way that the questions are raised within organizations that are working hard to keep lights on with crumbling infrastructure is that very often that feels like a separate battle and a whole host of learning that has to be done by the people who hold the purse strings. And I'm yet to see someone who chooses to start there, even though it is the best place to start. But when you have an hour-long meeting and you want to get to that, but actually your entire infrastructure can't do live updates because the markets are down over the weekend, so you manually turn everything off before you go home on Friday. This is a true story. Bank behind us. Then where do you start explaining to the people who are the custodians of the infrastructure that needs to be off over the weekend in order for an update to actually be conceivable? Where do you start the virtualization conversation with them? So the short answer to your question is that's absolutely best practice, but it's not a conversation that many people are going to.
I've got to agree with that. And everybody, when we voted here and when you ask people at banks, what's the objective, they say it's to deliver apps, APIs faster. In fact, I don't quite believe it. I believe that cost is a real driver here, and you only have to look at the problems of very well publicized problems of the Deutsche Banks and everybody else. They've become very dependent on outsourced suppliers of services. They're under continuing pressure to cut costs. How are they going to do it? How are they going to make the business case for investing in virtualization and automation when the immediate benefit is that they're employing 20,000 people directly or indirectly fewer in India, say?
All right, very good. I'm gonna stop us there so that you have a chance to have some tea and a little bit of a break. I think we have a 15-minute break. Is that right? We'll do 10? Okay, we'll do a 10-minute break. And when we come back, we'll hear from Eric, we'll hear from Arnaud, and we'll get a chance to see a demo. Thank you very much.
Thank you.